Hell Is Us perfectly captures the thrill of exploration, blending dense lore with one of the most hauntingly beautiful worlds I've seen in years. After spending over 30 hours finishing the main campaign and diving deep into its side content, I can confidently say this stands as one of the best releases of the year. Developed by Rogue Factor, Hell Is Us officially launches on September 4th, with Deluxe Edition owners gaining early access starting today. This game marks a bold shift for the studio, stepping away from its Warhammer roots into something far more ambitious. At its core, Hell Is Us is an action-adventure game with a semi-open world that rejects many of the genre's modern conveniences. There are no quest logs, no map markers, no glowing waypoints. Instead, the game asks you to rely on your own curiosity and sense of direction, making every discovery feel earned. Now, that might sound like a recipe for frustration, and at times, it absolutely is. I caught myself getting lost more than once, irritated by the lack of direction. But that's also the point. We've grown so used to games spoon-feeding us every objective that when Hell Is Us finally clicks, the sense of reward feels exponential. The world stops being confusing and starts being captivating, as though the game is teaching you to unlearn your reliance on hand-holding. Imagine playing Resident Evil, solving puzzles, figuring out where that one strange item belongs, but now take away the map and most of the jump scares. That's what Hell Is Us feels like. It's a game that really wants you to put on your thinking cap, maybe even keep a notepad nearby, and investigate every corner for clues that can help you move forward. Sometimes, though, you won't even find the solution right away. Certain puzzles or mysteries stretch across the entire map, which is divided into different regions, and you'll only be able to solve them once you unlock new areas. So don't beat yourself up if you get stuck. It's part of the design. Outside of the main quest, there are side objectives the game calls good deeds. Whenever you pick up an item or interact with something tied to one of these quests, a small pop-up appears with its name and the words good deed underneath. That's your cue that it can be solved. And just like in real life, you're not rewarded right away for doing them. For example, when you reach the Akasa marshes, you'll come across a woman trying to calm her friend's starving baby. But she can't feed him because, well, milk isn't exactly easy to come by in the middle of a war zone. To help her, you'll need to remember a small detail from an earlier area, the Sinedra Forest, where an NPC happened to have a big bottle of milk sitting right next to him. If you miss that visual cue the first time around, you'll find yourself running in circles until it clicks. That's the level of meticulous detail the game expects you to notice, and when it does, the payoffs feel earned. If you don't complete some of these good deeds in time, you don't get another chance. There's no timer on the screen, but your progress pushes the world forward, and certain events can permanently change what happens. When they do, the consequences can be devastating. Take the woman Judith and the baby as an example. Fail to help them, and when you return, the child has died and Judith is left behind in grief. Moments like this are a harsh reminder that in Hell Is Us, your choices or your inaction carry real weight. Sometimes, picking up an item or interacting with something doesn't trigger a good deed at all. It instead pops up as a mystery. These are a little different. Instead of helping someone out of kindness, mysteries usually lead you to rare loot, powerful gear, or sometimes even a hidden side quest. And just like with good deeds, they're not straightforward. Each one comes with its own puzzle-like objectives, pushing you to dig deeper into the world and track down the right items or clues before you can move forward. Eventually, you'll also stumble across massive anomalies, huge shimmering domes called Timeloops. Without spoiling too much, you can unlock a special item that lets you close them, but it's not as simple as walking up and pressing a button. To close a time loop, you'll first need to track down and defeat time loop guardians, which are dangerous enemies you'll run into throughout the entire game. Which brings us to the game's combat, one of the core pillars of Hell Is Us. When the game was first revealed, a lot of people assumed it would follow the Souls-like formula, but I'm glad to say it doesn't. Not because I dislike Souls-like games, but because not every other game has to be one. As you explore and investigate, you'll constantly run into the Hollow Walkers, those pale, twisted creatures that are at the heart of the game's mystery. To deal with them, you're given Lymbic weapons, which are infused with energy that makes them the only tools capable of cutting these things down. The arsenal is actually pretty impressive. Polearms, swords, axes, and greatswords, each with their own strengths and trade-offs. If you want speed, go with axes. If you want raw power, greatswords hit like a truck. If you have enough stamina, you can also chain attacks. So if you manage it well, each successive swing deals more damage. And I have to say, the weapons don't just play well, they look incredible. I honestly tried them all just because of how cool they looked, but my go-to setup ended up being a great sword paired with dual axes, switching back and forth depending on whether I needed speed or raw damage. But weapons alone aren't enough. As the game progresses, you unlock 4 unique elements: terror, ecstasy, grief, and rage, that you can infuse into your gear. They're not the usual fire or ice tropes, and each one changes not just the weapon's look, but also its abilities. Infusing an element also unlocks glyphs, which act as special powers during combat. For example, I infused my greatsword with rage and slotted in a glyph that let me summon spikes from the ground to weaken enemies before finishing them off. Another glyph tied to terror allowed me to walk past enemies without alerting them. These abilities add a ton of depth and variety, and they feel powerful in a satisfying way. On top of that, you can equip relics and artifacts that grant passive bonuses, though one thing that bugged me was weapon swapping. You can only switch between 2 weapons at a time, which feels restrictive. If you want to carry all 4 elements for maximum coverage, you'll have to pause and swap from the loadout menu instead of just cycling through them with a button press. It slows down the flow of combat, and I wish they had gone with a 4-weapon slot system instead. Now, let's talk about the enemies themselves. If you're expecting a huge bestiary, you might be disappointed. Most of the combat is against hollow walkers. The variety sits somewhere in the middle, not endless, but enough to stay engaging. Some hollow walkers spawn Hazes, which are manifestations of human emotions tied to the same 4 elements I mentioned earlier. Hazes even have tiers, with higher ones being much harder to beat. And when a haze is active, any hollow walker linked to it becomes completely invulnerable until you take the haze down, which adds an extra layer of strategy. There are also finishers that trigger when you stun an enemy, but I found them clunky and unresponsive, so I rarely use them. Hopefully that's something the devs clean up by release. As for Remy himself, combat comes down to health, stamina, and how you manage both. They're connected. Taking damage reduces stamina as well as health, which means the more hits you take, the less you can dodge or parry. I, personally, didn't enjoy dodging early on. It felt sluggish, like being weighed down in Elden Ring by equipping heavy armor. Instead, I leaned heavily into parrying. It's much quicker, more responsive, and doesn't consume stamina. But while you're in a parry stance, stamina won't recover either. A mix of the two is definitely the best way to go, though I use dodges sparingly, saving them for when I was surrounded and needed space fast. Interestingly, the game doesn't have a traditional leveling system, yet by the time I reached the end, my health and stamina bars were noticeably larger than when I started. I assume this growth is tied to upgrading gear or artifacts, though the game never really explains it outright. It was a little unclear, but the progression felt steady enough that I didn't mind. The real lifesaver, though, is the healing pulse ability. It's easily the most important skill to master. Healing items are scarce, so most of the time you'll rely on this mechanic. It works by reclaiming health based on the damage you deal. Time the input right when the ring around you solidifies, and you pull health back into your bar. It's tricky at first, but essential once you get it down. You're not completely alone out there either. You have a companion in the form of a pet drone, which acts as your torch when you're exploring and provides valuable support during combat. To make it useful, you'll need to equip it with drone modules, and these quickly become essential. Each module grants different abilities. Some help you deal more damage, others protect you, and a few even boost your mobility. I can't count how many times this little thing saved me. Sometimes it would distract hollow walkers while I focused on destroying their hazes, and other times it deflected projectiles from tougher enemies like the artillery walker, and trust me, that's one you really need to watch out for. That's the gist of combat in Hell Is Us. Don't get discouraged if the hollow walkers give you a tough time early on. Once you reach the blacksmith, gear starts improving and things gradually become much more manageable. Beyond combat and exploration, the game also gives you an armored truck that serves as your base of operations. Its main purpose is fast traveling between regions and researching the items you've collected out in the world. Though beyond that, its role is fairly limited. The story actually begins in the middle of a tense interrogation. with Remy being questioned by an unknown man about his illegal entry into Hedea, a country already torn apart by a brutal civil war. From there, Remy starts to recount his journey and the lengths he's willing to go to in order to find his missing parents. As his story unfolds, we learn about the two factions that dominate Hedea: the Palomists, who are deeply religious and hold firmly to tradition, and the Sabinians, who see themselves as progressive liberals, dismissing those old ways as primitive. Their clashing ideologies have fueled centuries of bloodshed, leaving the nation scarred and divided. Much of the story is framed through Remy's interrogation, but it's not an unreliable narrator situation. In fact, it's the opposite. Every time you die, you hear the interrogator adjusting your dosage, forcing you to reattempt, which reinforces the idea that Remy is telling things exactly as they happen.
Now, we both know that didn't happen. Start over.
Along the way, you meet a wide range of characters, each offering a different perspective on the world of Hedea. You speak with both Palomists and Sabinians, and what quickly becomes clear is that neither side is inherently good or evil. Instead, you see how people are shaped by emotions: terror, grief, rage, and how giving into those feelings often leads to rash, destructive decisions. Not every character is fully fleshed out, since your time with them is limited, but the themes they represent are woven in beautifully. The writing itself is sharp. I found myself exhausting every dialogue option I could, even the optional, fixed topics that any character could discuss, because the conversations were consistently insightful and often revealed valuable new perspectives on the conflict. And while the themes the game explores aren't exactly new, we've seen stories about the endless cycle of violence in many different mediums, the execution here is excellent. In fact, one comparison that stood out to me while playing was Attack on Titan, particularly the conflict between the Eldians and the Marleyans, which mirrors the way generational hatred and ideology fuel both sides in Hell Is Us. The narrative unfolds across 3 acts. The first introduces the major characters and sets the stage, while the second act is where the game really hits its stride. It's also the longest, giving you a series of objectives that each pull you down a rabbit hole into the history of Hedea. These stories work on their own, but they also tie together to reinforce the game's larger themes. My favorite moment came during an objective in the Sinedra Forest, where exploring a crumbling underground temple gradually revealed connections to the wider conflict. The third act wraps everything up. I'll talk more about that toward the end. There are plenty of twists and turns in the plot, but the backdrop does just as much heavy lifting. Every corner of Hedea feels scarred by the Civil War. Abandoned villages, checkpoints still guarded, ruins swallowed by nature. Exploration doesn't feel like sightseeing, it feels like walking through a graveyard of history. The visuals amplify that feeling with a hazy, oppressive art style and a richly dense color palette that ties into the game's 4 elemental themes. The result is a world that's both devastatingly haunting and visually striking, always reminding you of the cost of conflict. Then it all leads into the third and final act, which, to be honest, felt a little short and rushed. I wouldn't say it completely fell flat, but I definitely walked away wanting more, especially when it came to learning about the calamity itself. The game sets up this mysterious disaster throughout the story, but by the end, I felt like it held back more than it should have. There's also one character arc in particular that really stood out to me during the second act, and I was expecting it to go somewhere meaningful, but unfortunately, it didn't get the payoff I was hoping for. I can't say who it is without spoiling the game, but it left me feeling a bit let down, especially after how well that character was introduced earlier. Another highlight for me was the game's soundtrack. Right from the start, it reminded me of the sci-fi film Annihilation. Loud, heavy, and almost overwhelming at times, pulling at your emotions with its deep, resonant rhythm. It's not your typical video game score. Instead, it's a sound that immediately transports you into what feels like a retro 80s world. And in many ways, that's exactly the vibe the game is trying to capture, combining modern-day elements. On the technical side, I did run into one issue on PC where the game kept forcing a very low resolution, even after I changed it in the settings. I fixed it by manually adjusting the DPI scaling for the application. Aside from that hiccup, everything else ran smoothly. I didn't encounter any crashes or major bugs, and performance was solid overall. For reference, this was on high to very high settings with an RTX 3070. Just to note, this is all based on the PC version. I can't speak to how the game performs on consoles. Hell Is Us also uses a checkpoint-based save system. These appear as holographic devices scattered across the map, and whenever you reach one, you're given the option to save your progress. That doesn't mean you lose everything when you die, though. Enemies you've already defeated, conversations you've had, loot you've picked up, and puzzles you've solved all stay completed. Dying simply sends you back to the last checkpoint you activated. Now, the lack of multiple save slots is a bit disappointing since it means you can't roll back to an earlier point in the game. That said, I never found this system frustrating. In fact, I was relieved more than once after taking down a tough enemy and realizing it wasn't going to respawn.
I was born here, but I grew up on the outside. I spent years trying to get in.
Although Act 3 left me wanting more, Hell Is Us is still a haunting, challenging, and unforgettable experience. It's a bold new direction for Rogue Factor, one that makes me genuinely excited to see what they create next. And if they ever choose to return to Hedea, I'd happily dive back in and lose myself in its history all over again. So if you're looking for a solid action-adventure game, one that leans into science fiction and isn't afraid to take risks, Hell Is Us is absolutely worth your time.
I won't stop.